Hello, everyone. You just heard the song The Spread and the Bean by Joanna Newsom, which is an example of the 2000s folk subgenre known as freak folk. The term freak folk trended in 2004 after Devendra Banhart curated a compilation CD featuring artists like Vashti Bunyan, Joanna Newsom, Coco Rosie, and himself. Most freak folk artists rejected the label, but it described a cohesive sound best characterized by childlike vocals, unusual musical instruments, and lo-fi production quality. This week, I'm once again joined by professor and painter Madeline Rupard to discuss the genre. So I'm excited to talk about this one. You actually kind of came up with this topic because when I posted the Pinterest board for our Soft Colonial Wanderlust episode, you saw that I included the album cover for Have One on Me by Joanna Newsom, and you were like, oh, I'd love to discuss that with you. And so, here on my podcast, we don't usually just discuss one artist in depth. We talk about broader movements. And so we're going to just discuss freak folk because Joanna Newsom, even though she didn't really like being grouped into freak folk, she is kind of characteristic of it. So that's how we came up with the idea.
Yeah, no, it's, anytime I see anything Joanna Newsom related, because at this point she's kind of fairly niche and, it feels like ancient hipster history a little bit. But to me, it's like actually kind of ground zero for my music discovery journey, I would say. So I'm always excited to talk about her. I've been actually really excited about this podcast all week because, usually when you're a fan, you kind of have to temper your fandom around people so you don't annoy them.
Yeah.
That's the level of fandom I have for Joanna, but I'm like, okay, now it might be useful for a minute.
Yeah. And she's not like a super easy artist to get people into because it's like, oh, do you want to listen to this 17-minute song with me?
Exactly. It's not background music.
Yeah. And then also, it's not, her music isn't available on Spotify. I don't believe it ever has been. So you have to listen to it on YouTube or other platforms, which, I'm a Spotify user. And it's just not as easy to access. And I'm not on TikTok right now, so I don't know if her songs are even allowed on that platform either. But you kind of have to be in the know in order to get into her.
Totally. And I think she was maybe floating around on streaming services around the Last FM era,
Yeah.
when that was I know Last FM, I think it still exists, but when it was kind of in its prime as a way to listen to music for free in the era of Napster and torrenting.
Yeah. I bet you used to be able to put her music on your MySpace, but for me, actually, you said she was kind of ground zero for your musical interest. She was the first concert I ever went to when I think I was 14 years old. I was really into her. And it wasn't like I was listening to folk music all the time or this was the only thing I was into. I was into Crystal Castles and the Go Team and other disparate genres, but she really spoke to me back then.
Same. And I think I wouldn't have been able to get into her with kind of more pop candy versions of her that might exist. Like Regina Spektor, I think was a very important kind of gateway drug to the freak folk genre for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that was right when I was coming of age and, graduating high school and realizing, wow, there's this whole music world that exists mostly in Brooklyn, but also other places.
Yeah.
Such as Nevada City.
So before we get into freak folk a bit more, I'll just start out with two questions. So, it's been 8 months since we recorded our last episode together on Rest Stops. How have you been doing since then? Do you have any painting news to share?
Yeah, thank you. I do. I love that your show, we talk about all these diverse topics, but it's also connected back to the car and the way that the car influenced American culture. And I'm actually working on a show right now, or an exhibition at the Utah Museum of Contemporary Art opens on no less than September 11th, which feels kind of poetic in some way. But it's about my car. It's about my 2002 Subaru Forester that I no longer own. And it's kind of also all things with artists. It's kind of a metaphor or symbol for time passing and getting rid of. You see a lot more of these memes and posts people have about missing the old dials on cars rather than this constant iPad car. And so it's a little bit about that transition from 20th century mechanics into the way we live now, and also is paralleled with a friend who passed away. And so it's kind of it's this show that's a little bit about melancholy, which I also think is what Joanna Newsom's music is about, is transcendence through melancholy.
That particular shade of blue of the car you owned, do you happen to know it? Because I oftentimes find the names of car colors interesting.
That is such a good question. I don't know it off the top of my head. It's a really beautiful kind of royal blue color, and I'm excited because I had a chance through my job to study with students in Italy a couple of weeks ago, and I got lapis lazuli. So we're going to
Mm.
use lapis lazuli, this medieval pigment, to paint the car. But I don't know that particular color. I should look it up actually.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, it probably has a cool name.
oh, you know what? I might have just found it.
Oh, what is it?
Blue Ridge Pearl, paint code 95H.
Yeah, see, it's a cool name.
Gotta get into car colors.
Yeah. So, what kind of music do you typically listen to? Are you interested in folk music in general?
I definitely am. Like, American folk music is kind of when I teach my students, I say, "You should look at your influences," and, like, when Joanna, hit my heart in, like, my early 20s, I don't think I was ready for the whole world of American folk, like, I don't think I was mentally ready to understand Bob Dylan's discography, but I've gone back to that a lot in the last decade, and I also, like, have kind of delved into, lately I've been it's funny, you just did an adult contemporary episode recently, I've been, like, listening to a lot of that stuff, like, Zero 07
Love
and
Zero 07.
yeah, and, like, music that has that kind of easy listening, which I think the music we're gonna talk about today is, like, officially not that in some ways, you know?
Yeah.
So, I don't know, I really jump around, and I love, like, 70s, 80s kind of art rock too, like Kate Bush and Roxy Music. So kind of some of the predictable stuff if you're an art professor, actually.
Yeah. I never listened to my influences like you said, but, Kate Bush has kind of trended the last few years, and I think Joanna Newsom took at least some inspiration from her. I think I've read that in interviews.
Mhm. Yeah, she's really like she doesn't talk too much about her influences. I think like many female artists, she feels like nervous of, being compared to Joni Mitchell for the 1,000th time in a music review. But
Yeah.
but yeah, I think it's hard to when you look at some of the parallels in their work, it's hard to imagine she never heard her.
Yeah, for sure. So, freak folk, it can trace its roots back to what was called psychedelic folk. It's exactly what it sounds like. This was a folk subgenre in the 1960s. It was a blend of folk with psychedelia. Some famous names were Donovan, Pearls Before Swine, and Tyrannosaurus Rex, but I don't want to discuss it too in depth. Just, bringing them up really because a lot of freak folk musicians, they were raised by liberal slash ex-hippie parents who were into this stuff like Devendra Banhart, who we're about to get into in a moment. His first name, Devendra, it's a synonym for the Hindu god Indra. And his parents were actually like followers of this Indian religious leader, Prem. And I mean, you can get a good sense of what his parents were like. But he said in an interview that if there's anyone we relate to, it's our moms and dads and older hippies, people into Eastern philosophies and New Age. Yeah. And I mean, I don't get that sense with Joanna's parents too much, but a lot of them, you can tell their parents were a bit like crunchy.
I think that they were. I will say this, that I probably know way too much about Joanna, like, it's probably a little scary. But she was, like, this very important influence at a time in my life that I just, like, hungrily absorbed anything that she, like, wherever there was an interview or conversation, I was, like, taking notes very specifically because I was wanting to, like, emulate this artist's life I saw her putting out into the world. But her parents, she does let things slip here and there, and her parents are both doctors, but I have the sense that they were, like, cool hippie kids before that,
Yeah.
and that they were, like, progressives in the Bay Area, and so they moved out to Nevada City and I
Yeah.
think practiced in that small town, and, yeah, so I think you're right that it's kind of like a mix of, like, yuppie and hippie.
Yeah, for sure. So, Devendra Banhart, the etymology of freak folk can't be attributed to him, but he's really responsible for this becoming a subgenre that people became interested in. Because the term freak folk, it kind of bounced around for a few decades. People ascribed it to various folk musicians who were making music that was a bit weird. But his music, people started to square him into that box. He got called Freaked Folknik as early as 2003. And it was really his 2002 album, Omi Oh My, that, started to perpetuate this in the zeitgeist. Because according to the Freak Folk's very own Pied Piper, Much of his 2002 debut, Oh Me Oh My, was filled with abbreviated fragments of voice and guitar that he'd left on friends' answering machines, so it sounds really, really lo-fi. And I listened to the album, and it sounds like the type of music you'd hear baristas play at like hipster coffee shops in the 2000s. Like I can think of very particular ones I used to go to growing up in Chicago where like it kind of like reminds me of that time.
Mhm.
Is he someone that you've heard of before? Because I was kind of surprised, when I looked him up on Spotify, his music had like millions of plays, and I don't know exactly why it got so big, after the 2000s.
Yeah, I had heard of him. My parents are also kinda yuppie hippies at heart,
Hmm.
and my dad would play that song, "Sight to Behold," I think is one of his, like, very popular tracks, and he my dad would play that, like, years before we even got into Joanna Newsom in our family, and then I heard that they had toured together, and it was like, "Whoa, okay, so my parents are cool." Like, that they've been listening to this stuff for a while. But I wonder if he kind of also tapped into there was a lot of interest in, like I don't know, like, there was this it was we've talked about the utopian scholastic in
Yes.
this podcast before, and I feel like there was, like, a second wave of this after 9/11 where people really, like especially, like, the young upcoming generation of millennials really wanted to travel a lot, and there was a lot of, like what was that movie? Slumdog Millionaire came out, and I remember I was, like, more really wanting to go to India, and there was I don't think I was the only one, I feel like this was in the zeitgeist, and I think
Yeah.
Devendra had a little bit of this mystical, like, Eastern philosophy imbued in his music that was very obviously, it stood on its own with its own history that was rich, but it also got kind of, like, I guess, this is, like, the age of cultural appropriation, turning it into, like, music and things that we can more easily consume as Westerners.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about, okay, like say the lifespan of like a Eastern spiritual leader who was popular in his 20s or 30s, he would have been alive and older, still like attracting interest in the 2000s. They were, the names are not coming to me, but there are uh, like Eastern spiritual leaders who like lived into the 2000s and still retain following. So I think that might be part of it too.
Mhm.
But back to Devendra. Okay, so his music sounded a bit weird, but he by himself was not an entire movement. What he like really did to cause freak folk to enter the zeitgeist, in 2004 he compiled a a CD, The Golden Apples of the Sun for Arthur Magazine. It was a compilation CD, and he included songs by Vashti Bunyan, Joanna Newsom, Coco Rosie, and himself. And it grouped the sounds of those musicians together in this prepackaged way that made the public just start to think about it. And I really miss the days of curated compilation CDs because, you could only have 15 or 20 tracks. And that alone made it kind of feel like an anthology, which is very different than what we now experience on Spotify, where you open a playlist and there are hundreds of songs sometimes and it feels endless.
I hate the Spotify drop like, when there's a new album you're looking forward to, how it drops a track, like, every other week, and so you kinda know the whole album by the time it comes out. I don't know why it just bothers my, like, old world sensibilities of, like, "No, we need to listen to the album," in full
Yeah.
rather than in kinda scattered, but I understand how streaming services, like, that's, like, how they hype up an album.
I know there's so many weird things you can do on Spotify now, like pre-save songs. There was an artist recently who released like one half of his album at once and then dropped the other a couple of weeks later, and it was like, why? Uh, but this album though, it is a really good sample of freak folk. I recommend people listen to this over, say, like a Spotify playlist because a lot of these musicians you can't find them on Spotify, like Joanna Newsom. And Devendra, he included one song by himself on the album that I want to discuss because it included Vashti Bunyan on it. She collaborated on the track. Is Vashti Bunyan someone you've ever listened to?
Yeah, she was in that same kind of Last FM algorithm. She would come on, with some of her harp songs, and I think Joanna actually played harp on one of her songs,
From her second album, there was a song that, her second album being Looking After, there was a song that Joanna Newsom included some instrumentations for.
yeah, and this art was really beautiful. Her daughter's, like, a painter, and she would paint these, like, gorgeous kind of spindly animals. I mean, this is probably something comes up again, but, like, animals were, like, really in the air in the zeitgeist too, like, with,
Yeah.
like, the names of bands, but also, like, the kind of imagery that you were seeing attached to music and posters and things like that. There's like this kind of earthy consciousness again, you know?
Yeah, this was emerging around the white and green eras of hipster culture. You're probably familiar with Brad Trommel. He broke down hipster culture into 4 eras. And yeah, the green era, this was when bands like Animal Collective were big and people would talk about woodland creatures. And there was definitely like themes of nature moving through the zeitgeist. But Vashti Bunyan herself, really interesting. You know, she is an artist who wasn't really like psychedelic folk, but kind of adjacent. And it's important to sort of point out, though, that like freak folk musicians were directly taking inspiration from these artists from the 60s to the point that they were collaborating with them. But Vashti, she had an unsuccessful music career in the late 60s and early 70s before fading into obscurity for a couple of decades. Like she just became a mother and focused on that. And her work in the meantime, unbeknownst to her, became really sought after. Like her first studio album, Just Another Diamond Day, it started to sell for thousands online. And then in 1996, she discovered that her music had a cult following. And then she found her audience and started making music again. But she's like, as an artist, she kind of, I group her into this category of like folk musician where like they fell into complete obscurity for most of their lifetimes and then got rediscovered like Sybil Bauer. And I think people really like that kind of thing because it makes the folk music feel really authentic. Like these were just regular people for most of their lives who happen to make really good music. And I think you see this sort of impulse too with outsider art, where it makes it like feel very real.
Totally. Outsider art, I mean, I think of like the big Hilma af Klint retrospective that happened in like 2019 at Guggenheim and how she kind of blew up in like, you know, hundreds of years after her artist life, she's like getting this crazy commercial success, which is like the irony of artist life a lot of the time. But I like how it happens. The cycle seems sometimes a little bit quicker with music. Like one of my favorite bands to this day is Slow Dive. And I noted that like I was listening to them maybe 20 years after they had been making their work. And then they got this new resurgence with like Gen Z who really loves like shoegaze genre. The shoegaze genre is like really like compelling and being kind of re-envisioned for them too. So it's interesting to see how sometimes you're just, you know, you're onto something, but the world isn't quite ready yet. And I think that was the case with Vashti as well.
Yeah. I mean, her music is great. Like I love songs like Diamond Day, Train Song, Winter is Blue. She's also someone I was listening to in middle school around the time I found Joanna. I'm pretty sure probably because I read some articles back in the day on Joanna Newsom and, you know, they mentioned how it sounded similar to Vashti. But I want to play the song now from the Golden Apples of the Sun that's a collaboration between Vashti Bunyan and Devendra Banhart. This is Rejoicing in the Hands.
In the dark we are without her embrace light. In the dark we are without her light. Half asleep we're calmly waiting through her night. Half asleep we wait till she arrives.
So Banhart, he wrote a personal letter to Vashti in 2001, and then they formed a personal connection. They collaborated on 3 songs over the next 2 decades. And I actually really like this one. Is this a song you had a chance to hear, by the way?
I didn't. Yeah, sorry about that. I didn't get
okay.
to listen to this one yet.
What's interesting to me about this one is it sounds very much like an OG Vashti Bunyan song. And I'm pretty sure that Devendra actually composed the instrumentals with the guitar. And it just shows like a really deep understanding of her work. And she contributed vocals for this. And, you know, she sounds really soothing. Her voice often gets called childlike, like pretty much all of the musicians we're going to discuss today, but it's in a different way. It's still more adult-like. And there's just a simplicity to her music that I really like.
Yeah, and I think that she was like she had a career before in like go-go dancing, or she was like a go-go musician in some sense. So it's funny to think about this kind of similar trajectory, but happening in maybe a different timeline and obviously a different country. She's from England, of like being part of this more commercial pop thing and then getting tired and jaded. Like that feels like kind of a little bit of the narrative arc of the music coming out of the early aughts, where a lot of those artists maybe listened to that stuff growing up and then they were like, you know what, I kind of want to do things our own way, you know?
Yeah, I don't think that Vashti Bunyan ever really thought of herself as a folk musician. Like she admired pop music a lot, but then her music didn't really sound that much like pop. But I mean, that's an interesting comparison to make because, she in her own youth, when she was active in the 60s and 70s, didn't like the labels that were being attributed to her. And then all of these freak folk artists, they also really bristled at the label of freak folk. They really hated it. Like there was an interview that Devendra did in 2010 where he said, "I don't know a single person that has ever been called any of the horrid freak folkisms who has ever said, 'Yep, that's what we play, freak folk.' Not a single person that I know." And I've done like 100 episodes on Silent Generation. A lot of them are on like subgenres, artistic movements, and this is just something you see like over and over again, where it's like Electroclash, Witch House, like all of these artists don't like the term that gets ascribed to them. And I don't think it really has anything to do with the accuracy of the term. Like if you came up with a perfect one, they probably still wouldn't like it because I think they just would rather conceptualize themselves as being like lone artists who are like individual geniuses, which they are in many cases, but they just want to view themselves as being part of an avant-garde instead of being boxed in. I don't know. Is that something that like you can speak to as an artist? Like if someone were to like group you into an artistic movement that you weren't coming to on your own terms, like how would you feel about that?
Well, I think that what you're describing is like a long-term tension between art and art historians.
Yeah.
Like, um, and I think that I understand the resistance to be labeled, especially if you feel like it's going to pigeonhole your work or put expectations on the kind of music you make.
Mm-hmm.
How you need to there's this need to rebel and to kind of resist that. And it might be strange too for people to assume you were part of some organized movement when you're like, no, I've been like fighting my own battles in my studio for years. But I think there's no problem with art historians trying to understand and categorize things with language. I mean, this is like it's taxonomy, and I
Yeah.
think it's okay. It's okay also for artists to be annoyed. Like maybe both of those things are true, like it's okay for both of those relationships to be strained a little bit. But I think I understand the artists need to carve out their own independence and their own kind of space, but they can't. There is a truth that you always are connected to everything else that's happening. Even
Yeah.
if you put yourself in a vacuum, that is still an interesting relationship, and you will be compared to either in like how different you are or how similar you are to things, because that's people are just trying to figure out the world and trying to understand it through language, and language is imperfect. So I don't know. I see both sides of it, as both someone who's like academic and loves the encyclopedic archival mindset, but also it is strange when if someone was to come up to me and be like, "Yeah, you're kind of part of this." Someone came up to me recently and was like, "You're part of this thing called burger punk."
What is burger punk?
I don't know if he wasn't saying like I was that. He was actually he was being funny about it, but um, I was like, "Oh, I guess it's like crust punk, but like more like getting off the highway to the gas stations or something." And I was like, "Huh, I've never heard that term."
Like Breezewood, Pennsylvania, like
Yeah,
we talked about
exactly.
in rest stops. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, Breezewood core, like, I guess, European mind cannot comprehend this core, like, that's and I don't know, like, I think it's funny, I'm not offended, but I also feel like, yeah, it's funny because like, for some reason, I've just been obsessed with these for, like, a decade,
Yeah.
and there is a big movement of people getting interested in this stuff, and some of them have been doing it for a while, and some of them have just started, and it's just, part of the chaos of the whole human consciousness of making art.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe the attitude that artists and creatives should have is that they should think of themselves as the avant-garde. It's much better for them to like try to be as genuinely creative as they can be, as opposed to like finding a movement or style and being like, oh yeah, I want to emulate this and understand all of the like elements or motifs and then just replicate it. That's not what they should do to start out. But then once later in their career, once someone inevitably does like come up with a term for what they're doing, they shouldn't get that mad about it, even if the term is a little bit pejorative, like freak folk, which actually I really don't think that the term is that bad, like freak. Like that's not that bad of an insult. But
Mhm.
yeah.
I also heard the term anti-folk coming around too at that time, which was interesting to me. I didn't quite understand that as like a teen. I was like, "Anti, wouldn't that be against?" But it sounds like folk music. But
Yeah.
people were just trying to throw terms to understand what was happening because there certainly was something happening, even if they felt like individual groups. I mean, Devendra and Joanna were touring together. And I remember there was this interview with Joanna that always stays with me as an artist, and maybe also qualifies why she's important to me.
Yeah.
But she talked about how a lot of people, want to be in a band because they want to look like they're in the band. Like, they want to be on stage and to be perceived as, like, being a musician. And she said in this interview, like, if you want to make something powerful, then it has to be something more than the desire to be in a band. It has to be like you're trying to get something out of your system.
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe more what it is. Like, there's like this spirit that kind of moves over us, and that for some reason, like, there's a collective zeitgeist of, like, we're all interested in certain elements and motifs for a while, and it moves on to the next thing in the next decade. And it's really mysterious and interesting. But at the core, you should be making art for your own sake first, I think.
Yeah.
That's how I see it.
Yeah. That's something I kind of feel with the podcast. On a personal level, I view it as like a very creative project, kind of as my life's work. And I have that drive because it's a ton of work. I mean, you've seen it twice now. It's like 40 or more hours a week for me.
Well, and you put so much energy into, like, the research. Like, everything is researched to the nth detail. Like, I can tell you are a librarian.
Yeah. Speaking of, though, there is like one influence of freak folk that I didn't really realize until you brought it up to me, and that is this sort of like medieval revivalism that was popular in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah. Well, and again, going back to this idea of looking at your influences, like, there was only so much, because Joanna doesn't put out that many albums, like, and she puts them out like once every 5 years, and now it's like once every 10, 15 years if we're lucky. We're still waiting for the album. There's a lot of like Mac rumors about it on Reddit.
Yeah.
But when you run out of Joanna songs, then what do you have to do? You have to look at what she was listening to, which is what I did. I created a funny Spotify playlist called Joanna Newsom is Not on Spotify, and I actually got a lot of followers, I think, because now if anyone searches Joanna Newsom, that's what comes up because she's not on Spotify.
Yeah.
And so if you want to listen to her influences, feel free to follow that.
Yeah, I'll link it in the show notes.
It's basically like a catalog of different things that she's brought up. Some of them are maybe not things she's brought up, but things that I think might have influenced her for my own artistic license. But there's a lot of like Sandy Denny and Fairport Convention. She mentions in an interview that there's artist Roy Harper, who has actually been really influential in a lot of like 70s rock. He was like a British folk artist who was really playing a lot with like song structures, and a lot of these artists were kind of referencing things from like old English tales, or like they were referencing things from like you'd hear in medieval or Chaucer stories, old like Irish folk tales, Scottish folk tales, and they were bringing them back into like this music that they were making in the 20th century.
Yeah.
I really love Fairport Convention. I think their music is really beautiful and ethereal, and Sandy Denny has this gorgeous voice. If you know that song Battle of Evermore by Led Zeppelin, she's that like ethereal female vocal in that song. So they were often like collaborating with these more popular bands, and I think that a lot of these California freak folk artists were interested in that history.
Yeah. I listened to Fairport Convention a little bit for this week, and Maddie Grooves, that track, I can hear this like sort of medieval influence. And another place I think this might have been coming from is just from like church music. Like Judy Sill, who's like a little bit less explicit with these themes, but you can hear this sort of like the way she composes music, it sounds sort of like you're in church vaguely, because she was an organist and pianist and extremely religious. And I think that might be another way that sort of seeped into this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and she, like, Joanna also, like, what I love about her is that she's kind of similar to Bjork in that she's not snotty about music. I don't know if you've ever seen that interview with Bjork where someone's asking her like what she thinks about pop music, and she's like, sometimes you need a French fry and sometimes you need a banana, and there's nothing wrong with both of those things. Like, that's Joanna also like loved like Judy Collins, who's I think thought of as maybe more of a kitschy American folk singer, like more mainstream at least. And she references some of her older songs as influences because they had these kind of strong, long narrative structures that were a little bit more abstract, so somewhat like a Bob Dylan song where you're not entirely sure what's going on, but it's interesting.
Yeah. So, some of the elements of freak folk, which I want to talk about now, They are, partly maybe coming from this like medieval revivalism, but I would just want to bring these up briefly. So some of the elements of freak folk, the big one I think is childlike vocals. And the vocal style is very specific. So it's not childlike in this like hyper pop PC music way. It's always a bit raspy in this way that kind of sounds old. And you can also maybe describe that way of singing as being otherworldly or ethereal or mystical. But artists like Joanna Newsom didn't like those terms either. So you kind of can't win, but there is just like this particular way of singing that you find in the genre. And then another one is, unusual musical instruments. So traditional acoustic ones can work, like guitars, pianos, and drums. Like there are plenty of freak folk songs where it's just like one person on a guitar. But the more unusual instruments are even more emblematic, like harps, banjos, harpsichords. Even like this really obscure one I learned that Animal Collective sometimes plays called the hurdy-gurdy. Have you ever heard of that?
I have, but I can't tell you I know what it looks like.
It looks crazy. I don't even know how it works.
Yeah, going back to the image thing, I do feel like that's like a PR thing to some degree, because actually when you look at some of Joanna's like early kind of moments with press, like her first email was like unicorn tears, so she definitely was leaning into it earlier, and then I think she got tired of maybe those slightly, like misogynistic visions of like who she was, or she interpreted them to be that way. And I understand it's like probably nerve-wracking when you're a female artist in a male-dominated industry to be like subjugated to that terminology.
Yeah. No, she like maybe at first like was having fun with people interpreting her as being like magical, but then she just wanted to be taken seriously. I mean, she was a very prolific or is a very prolific artist.
Mhm.
And then, most of the musical instruments are acoustic, but sometimes you hear electronics a little bit. It's largely with loops, like with Tune Yards and Animal Collective. They'll use like loops to make their voices sound layered. And then Tune Yards too, we're not really going to discuss her today, but she's a really good example of lo-fi production. Like a lot of the recordings were pretty lo-fi, and there's this like Pitchfork review of her album Bird Brains where they put it really well, where when you talk about lo-fi more or less inspired by folk, the best stuff always carries with it a sense of discovery. Cheap and tinny acoustic music should feel like something you stumbled upon, like maybe you dug it out of an old drawer or rescued it from the freebie bin of the thrift store. And Merle Garbus, the main person behind Tune Yards, she accomplished that by recording everything from that album with a handheld voice recorder, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, there's this kind of feeling with re-listening to Animal Collective this week and Joanna's music and some of these other artists, like that there's always a sense of play, like
Yeah.
almost going back to that primordial instinct you have as a child, like bang on like pots and pans, like that there's this desire just to see what happens. And I think on Joanna's Newsom's end, it was like a little bit more Baroque, where like, she studied at these incredible like folk summer camps in the summer in California. And so she was learning about instruments like tambura, caval,
Yeah.
like all these kind of international instruments, and putting them back into her music in a kind of more Baroque way. But then there's also that desire just to like play with things in a lo-fi way on the other end of the freak folk spectrum, I think.
Yeah, her first album is more or less just her on the harp, but there's a range in terms of, and I don't know exactly how she accomplished it with different tracks, but it doesn't just sound like every song was recorded in the same way or even with the same instruments somehow. There's this documentary I watched for this week that I'll talk about later, The Family Jams, but in that she's kind of playing around in one point of the movie, and she threads this like ribbon through the chords of the harp and then plays it, and it has this completely different sound. And yeah, it was cool to see that. But in terms of play, I think Coco Rosie, who we're going to talk about later, they really embody that. The two of them, the two sisters who founded the band, they've explained the musical project as kind of being a way for them to experience childhood again as adults, because they didn't really get to be kids when they were children.
Yeah, and there's like that kind of sense of either trying to recover childhood or like having a very playful childhood that allowed you to explore these ideas and sounds and textures.
Yeah. So now we can start to talk about Joanna Newsom. This is going to be the big section for the episode, and we're both really excited about it. So to start out with her biography, she's a singer, songwriter, harpist and pianist from Nevada City, California. That's somewhere you've been, right?
Yeah, I took a pilgrimage, like, 2 years ago. I went to see actually PJ Harvey, who's, like, kind of the Joanna Newsom of my 30s. I saw her play live, she was on tour, and then I rented a car and drove from San Francisco to Nevada City, and I'd always wanted to go there because I'd been listening to Joanna for so long, and she actually has, like, songs about her city and about this little mountain town. It's an old gold rush town, really cute, kinda has, like, a Old West feeling to it, and there's some famous characters that, like, lived there, including, like, this woman,
Oh,
Lola Montez, who was, like, kind of a famous courtesan that Joanna references in a lot of Have One on Me, and there's a restaurant I ate at called Lola Cafe that actually it's, like, one of those meals I still think about. It was so delicious. It was, like, this lamb ragu, and then, like, a really fresh Caesar salad as if they had just plucked it out of the back of the cafe, and it was really divine. So, beautiful town, and if you ever get a chance to go through there on the way to California, like San Francisco, Yosemite, or something, definitely stop by because I think you'll be charmed, and there's a lot of really cute vintage stores, so
yeah. No, a video of it randomly popped up in my Instagram feed this week, and it looked really charming. As an adult, she would sometimes talk about in interviews how, like, everyone her age wanted to move away, but she wanted to stay in her hometown, and themes of her hometown in California can be found throughout her albums. But I learned this week that she eventually did move because she met and then married Andy Samberg of SNL fame. They later had 2 kids, but now they live in LA, which I'm kind of surprised by. Like, I can't imagine, like, running into Joanna Newsom in Los Angeles, but I'm sure some people do.
my sister lives out there, and they do, like they're around for sure, like,
Mhm.
they're involved in, like, their local childcare and stuff like that, so they're definitely, like, having a Hollywood presence, but, yeah, it's interesting to think of Joanna in LA. It's, like, a little bit strange to me as well, but she is, like, at heart, like, a true like, she loves California so much, like, every interview she talks about, like, I don't know, it's like she's a true poster child for, like, the good things about California, like, that kind of, like, hippie energy and the, like, way that she's, like, you know, embraced, the history there, and, like, I think she's a good example of someone that, like, loves her locale and, like, kind of represents it in a way, you know?
Yeah. I'm kinda like that too. I mean, I live in the city I grew up in, Chicago. I've never lived anywhere else, and I respect that a lot. But overall, her, like, biography, her life details, people have figured out a lot because she has so many obsessive fans who, like, comb through the music and all her interviews to figure out as much as they can. But she's relatively private. We're lucky to know the things that we do.
Yeah, totally, and I think that seems like another part of, like, her class act way of being a celebrity, which is to basically try to be off camera as much as possible, but she has really good red carpet fashion, just for the record.
Yeah. And so in her musical career, she's released 4 albums. We're gonna discuss all of them today. One of them being a triple album, Have One on Me. And, we're gonna start out with The Milk-Eyed Mender. So this was her first full-length studio album. She did release 2 APs in 2002 and 2003, but, this one, The Milk-Eyed Mender, it came out in 2004, right when Golden Apples of the Sun came out, so she got associated with freak folk early in her career, but she never liked the label. Her personal observations on it were that when people would put me and Devendra Banhart in the same sentence, they were coding his eccentricities as world-weary and witchy, and coding my eccentricities as childlike and naive. I felt like it minimized my intelligence. So I do feel kind of bad, grouping her into this. I mean, after thinking about it all week, like, how do you feel personally about, say, like, calling her music freak folk? Do you feel like you shouldn't, or do you feel comfortable doing it?
I understand the desire to contain it to a category, and I understand the desire to push away from it. I think, like, when you put something into the world, you kind of relinquish a little bit of control of how
Yeah,
people are gonna perceive and organize it to some degree.
that's true. I mean, I think she's just, like, so much bigger than this. All the artists we're gonna talk about today, they feel like they've kind of fallen into the wayside to various degrees, but she, I mean, in my world, in a lot of people's minds, is just as important as ever. I mean, she hasn't released new music in a while, but she's still, like, incredibly popular.
But I think that that's true about every genre that someone falls into or at least overlaps with, like, that there's people that will will stand the test of time, and that there will be people that kind of fall into obscurity. I mean, you think of like 80s music and like how Tears for Fears still sounds so good. And then there's like for every Tears for Fears, there's like probably like 50 to 100 like bad new wave bands that we've forgotten about. Or
Yeah.
maybe we'll every once in a while get resurrected on TikTok because of how funny it is and like how dated it sounds, you know? So I feel like Joanna, like I think of her, obviously, you know, I'm very biased, but I think of her as very timeless. I think she's like tapped into something more eternal and kind of in conversation with the cosmos. And I think that those who are open to those conversations in music are really drawn to her and like feel like she's a gift when they find her. But I do think that like some of the things she did that were successful, like that's actually quite amazing to be a little bit avant-garde but also have enough commercial success that you can continue a career, and she really hit that mark really well. Because someone like Slowdive or Vashti Bunyan, it took like 20 years to percolate for us to understand, but Joanna was able to, within the language and interests of that zeitgeist, was able to like become commercially popular while making this like deep and moving music, which is pretty astounding. I think every artist kind of hopes they'll have a career like that, but not everyone gets to.
Yeah. Her first album, The Milk-Eyed Mender, it had a lot of commercial success because it sold 200,000 copies. I mean, which is crazy to think about because she was like, I don't even know if she was 20. No, she must have been in her early 20s when the first album came out. But I want to play one song from it for the audience. This is Bridges and Balloons.
We sailed away on a winter's day with fate as malleable as clay. But ships are fallible, I say, and the nautical, like all things, fades, and I can recall our caravel.
So Bridges and Balloons is really emblematic of Joanna Newsom's early sound in that it incorporates polyrhythms. So polyrhythms are when two separate rhythms play simultaneously, and it's a musical technique that's endemic to African music. Joanna Newsom happened to learn the technique, when she was 12 years old at a summer camp called Lark Camp.
Yeah, and I think that also is a sign of her kind of child prodigy energy, you know, like, even though she kind of came into herself in maybe her early 20s, like, I think this had been building for a really long time, and she wanted initially to be like a classically trained harpist that played in symphonies. She applied to schools, like really fancy orchestral schools, and I think there's an interview where she says, "I got the response, but I didn't wanna look at it because I didn't wanna be rejected, so I just tore it up and threw it in the trash." And thank goodness in some ways that she didn't go down that career path because we wouldn't have this music.
Yeah. No, I'm glad she became a singer-songwriter. She did want to play the harp from a really young age, but her parents made her learn piano first because that was just recommended. It's a bit of an easier instrument to start with, apparently. But yeah, I mean, at that camp, she was like apparently playing into the night, according to this one article from the New York Times. Like, she was really dedicated to this from the young age. And then another thing that listeners should just take note with Bridges and Balloon is just her vocal style, because it eventually changed, which we'll talk about in a moment. But this is, you know, when people were saying that she sounded extremely childlike, and just take note of what that sounds like.
Well, I don't know how much I'm jumping ahead of you, but I can at some point mention that she got these vocal nodes
Yeah.
too that kind of forced her to change her music a little bit.
Yeah, we can just bring that up now.
Okay.
We'll note later, you know, when the change happened. But are you more of a fan of her early work with her original vocal style or her later work after the change in 2009?
I truly love it all. Like, it's all part of the beautiful tapestry that Joanna Newsom's music career is in my heart. But I will say that the ones that speak to me, Have One on Me to me is like this album I return to and return to and return to, and it kind of feeds me still to this day. I'm amazed at its power to like still give me artistic kind of energy. And I think that it's not also something you can kind of listen to if you've listened to it 1,000 times, and you can kind of have it in the background just while you're like thinking through your own artistic problems.
Yeah.
But I mean, Milk-Eyed Mender, there's some songs on there that like actually hit me more hard than they did when I first listened to them. Like Sadie, to me, like Sadie is about a I mean, to say her songs are about anything is kind of funny because they're always about like 1,000 things. But I know that part of it is about her dog being killed
Oh.
by it was kind of a sad situation with a neighbor, and that song. But it's that's the thing about her, is she's really into like poetry and T.S. Eliot, and T.S. Eliot was always like, if someone comes up to me and asks me what my poems are about, I'm just going to start saying them from the beginning again, you know. So Joanna's kind of like that, where it's not really about that thing. It's like it's about grief. But it's about a deeper thing, you know. And I think Milk-Eyed Mender has moments that are extremely poignant and beautiful. East to me is like always associated with this feeling of like being a young woman coming into the world and kind of being bewildered by the world, and like that album means so much to that time of my life. I still return to some of those songs.
Yeah.
But the whole thing, Divers is a little bit more mature. The whole discography, which is really just officially 4 albums, right, is so rich, and there's so much there.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think I prefer the vocal change a little bit more, but that's also because I'm privy to Have One on Me. I actually had the like whole triple album after the concert I went to at 14. My sister and I purchased a copy. So, and I mean, I'm old enough to have done this. Like I had like a CD player in my room and I would like play it as like a tween. So yeah, and I mean, I think just by virtue of it being a triple album, you can listen to it more times in a row. By the time you get to the end of it, you know, your mind has already moved on and it doesn't feel as repetitive. So I think that helps.
Yeah, going back to that Bjork metaphor, like the idea of like the banana and the French fry, I like to talk about this too in the terms of art, like fast food versus like whole grain bread that takes a long time to digest.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I start my song with like a Charlie XCX song, if I start my day with a Charlie XCX song, then it like kind of it can get me running really fast, and like I'll get that dopamine hit real quick. But it's a different experience than listening to a Joanna Newsom song for the 12th time that you've kind of slowly digested and like slowly gives you energy. Like they're different kinds of artistic consumption, and I think they're all valid, but there's something about Joanna Newsom that just stays with you the more you listen.
Yeah. And I think now we can maybe move on to her second album, her sophomore album. This is Ease from 2006. It's spelled like YS, but it's actually named after, or the name takes inspiration from this mythical French city that got swallowed up by the ocean. So the album, it has some aquatic themes that you can parse through. And it's impressive that she released this album when she was only 24 years old, because she like really leveled up with this. There are orchestral arrangements. And I originally thought that I hadn't listened to this album in entirety because I only remembered a few songs. But then it turns out I only remembered a few songs because it only has 5. There are only 5 tracks that range from 7 minutes to 17, and they're great. But yeah, that's what explains like the short song count.
Yeah, and it was actually this album was produced and recorded by 2 pretty famous people in the music business, Van Dyke Parks.
Mm-hmm.
Joanna had stumbled across Van Dyke Parks' work. I think a boyfriend had handed her like the Song Cycle work that he did in the 70s. He's known for his longtime collaborations with the Beach Boys and the Smile Sessions with Brian Wilson, but he was very experimental and always kind of pushing what songs could do and their structures. And Joanna, I think, was excited by that. And so she reached out to her record label, Drag City, who were able to connect her with him. She says in this interview with Mark Barone that they sat in like a hotel room and she played like all of East for him. And you could tell like the way she was talking about this was like a moment in her life that was so important to her. And that he paid her like a nice compliment that she wouldn't repeat to the audience in the podcast, but he ended up working with her and creating those orchestral kind of sweeping feelings throughout that album. I think Van Dyke Parks is actually also an important reference for Animal Collective when we get to them, because when I was listening to those albums, I'm like, man, this sounds so much like him. Like I can see that they were also tapped into the same musical history. But anyways, it was also recorded by Steve Albini, who is also famous for doing some extremely different kinds of albums, a lot of like 90s grunge, like the Pixies, I should say, PJ Harvey, Rid of Me, and some of Nirvana's work too. So you think about someone who just had range and what he could work on, and this album is much more crystal clear and kind of, very much of its time versus PJ Harvey's like 90s kind of female angst that I love so much, but is such a different flavor.
Yeah. I mean, I've like listened to interviews over the years where it's apparent like she didn't, come up with every single instrumentation for her songs. She had all of these collaborations that people were contributing to make it the orchestral product that it ended up being. That doesn't detract from it at all. I think it adds to it a lot. I mean, because within this album, Ease, she had like her ex-boyfriend, Bill Callahan, and her sister Emily contribute some vocals. And speaking of, I want to play part of Emily, so I'm going to play that now.
Emily, they'll follow your lead by the letter, and I make this climb, and I'm not ashamed to say I knew you better. What they've seen is just a beam of your sun that banishes winter.
So Emily, it's named after, Joanna Newsom's sister, Emily. And so despite being, pretty private about her personal life, Joanna, she divulges details about it in her songs. Like with the lyrics of Emily, you can kind of pick up, they don't have a perfect relationship. She's not idolizing it. She's also not saying that the relationship's bad, but she's very honest. And there's some things you can parse out where like they're not, exactly always on the same page. But it's interesting to hear.
Yeah, familial relationships are like a constant theme. Like really, like romance and familial relationships are this theme that she always like manages these things that are so hard to like communicate with other people because they're so large and abstract. And the way you know someone, the way I know you versus someone else is so it's like it's such an interesting concoction of emotions that we experience interpersonally with people. But she's able to like put it back into like a way where it communicates something deeper and more specific than if you were to like say these things outright. She has that kind of Bob Dylan touch to her. That's like, I mean, obviously it's just poetry. That's what poetry does.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure at some point some of your lyrics have been about Andy Samberg, but it never feels that reductive. It always feels like it's greater than her. Mm-hmm. And it's not just about him.
That's the beauty, right? That there's a PJ Harvey quote where she says like, that's the beauty of music is that you put something out in the world and you just have no idea how people are interpreting it. And that's why it's so magic.
And with Emily, there's another interesting portion of the track where Joanna, she starts explaining the difference between a meteorite, a meteor, and a meteoroid. 3 terms that describe different things. And the lyrics sound very poetic, but they're actually more or less a factual description. And it's probably her recounting a conversation she had with her sister Emily, because her sister is an astrophysicist. And Joanna Newsom's music is like a great way to learn vocabulary. I mean, especially if you're in middle school, you're about to take all of these like standardized tests. Like there are some big vocabulary words I learned, like antediluvian. That's one of my favorites. That describes the period of the Bible before the Great Flood. Do you have any favorite vocabulary words you've learned from her?
Yes, but I gotta admit, I'm like I said, I'm kind of a fake academic, so I feel like I know the words, but I don't always know what they mean. She has some really great words like asterisms, inchoate, palanquin. Palanquin's one of my favorites. That's from the song Go Long, which is to me one of the most beautiful, most haunting songs about men-women relationships.
Yeah.
Wall-eyed, yarrow, told you would. I mean, also maybe of note is that this was a time when there was a lot of natural history kind of coming into musical discourse. I was also listening to Andrew Bird at this time in my life. He's in your local Chicagoan as well, right?
Yeah.
But he was always referencing birds and science in his music that was obviously about things more cosmic than that. And so I think this was definitely in the air and she was tapping into that as well.
Yeah. No, I mean, her vocabulary is like literally insane. I've learned so many like minute details from her. And it's not just like the individual words. It's also like, I mean, these like short quips, these lyrics that you can take away that like on their own just like feel like they have so much meaning.
She's a big reader. I have a sense that her dad had like this big library that she just like read and read and read out of. Because she just has this like way of playing with language where it's not just about the thing you're saying, but it's also the way it sounds in the song and the way that those words are like almost abstract shapes. Like I can't help but think of it like a painter, like the way that they fill that space and kind of activate that time within the song. I love a few of her metaphors, like they're just so beautiful. Like you can take my hand in the darkness, darling, like a length of rope, or My heart made a sound like snow falling from eaves. Like, there's something true that, like, when you're disappointed, that's exactly what your heart sounds like. It's like that little bloom, feeling. Like, she's just so good at, like, surmising things so quickly and so economically. I also think about, like, that kind of we think of this as Baroque music, but also there's, like, this almost Renaissance quality where you look at, like, old Botticelli paintings, and they say that there's, like, 150 species in that Primavera painting by Botticelli,
Hmm.
and I still remember the Pitchfork review for East because I, like, read it obsessively over and over again, and they talked about how she would reference every, name of and species of every plant along the way of the thing she's getting at. So there's something about that detail orientation that's also very Nabokovian, to be obsessed with, like, every little footnote and to put it into the song and think of it as meaningful.
Yeah. I mean, something I just realized, uh, like academics, they've done studies where they figured out like, okay, modern American children, they can only identify a few tree species, but they know like they can recognize like tons of different logos and names of corporations. Like our identification has like we can identify the same number of things maybe as people 100 years ago, but what we identify is very different. And her lyrics make me think of a time, 1700s, 1800s later, where people just paid attention to these small details of the natural world and knew these things. I mean, maybe it's exaggerated, like they didn't happen to know the names of all these tree and plant species, but it harkens back to a time like that.
Yeah, the breezewoodification of our brains in some ways, right? Like, just the things that we encounter in our day-to-day maybe, and Joanna, it seems like she lived in a world that her parents put her in places where there were natural wonders around her as well as, like, instruments she could play with, so she's the product of that raising.
Yeah. And then on Ease, there are 5 tracks. Uh, the one we played, Emily, isn't necessarily one of your favorites. Only Skin and Sawdust and Diamonds are some of your favorites, right?
Yeah, I think the first song I ever encountered was probably, I think someone uploaded part of Family Jams onto YouTube in, like, 2011,
Hmm.
and I had been recommended Joanna Newsom on Last FM, so I, like, looked her up on YouTube, and there was, a clip of her playing Sawdust and Diamonds, and that was maybe the moment that I was compelled by her because it was her earlier years where her vocal cords were she was singing in that childlike way you're talking about,
Yeah.
and she was almost in this trance in this, like, kinda lo-fi home video, and I just was like, "What is going on?" I'd never seen anything like that in my life as, like, a 18-year-old, like, who had been mostly listening to the radio on the way to school, you know? So I was really compelled by it.
Yeah. I'd originally been shown Joanna Newsom by uh, my second oldest sister. I have 5, and I've mentioned on the podcast before that my older siblings, like, I'm able to sort of understand the mid 2000s, like what came before. Really, when I came of age, partly because I have all these siblings and I can kind of reconstruct farther back than the average person. But that was how I discovered it. Um, but I was kind of immediately drawn to Have One on Me. I think I discovered her around when that came out because, Have One on Me was released in 2010. I would have been like, that would have been when I was in like the 8th grade. But now we can start to move on to it. So Have One on Me, I would say safely that it's like her magnum opus because it's a triple album. And, it felt more ambitious even than like Ease did, even though Ease felt really ambitious because it had all that length, but she also played piano for some tracks and it felt like this like expansion of what she'd already been kind of doing.
Yeah, and the, album art itself is like a signal, I think, of her moving out of this medieval kind of Ren Fair thing into something a little bit more contemporary, although we've only maybe moved up a couple centuries, like in the 19th century, it almost looks like in that image. But as soon as you start listening, you realize that this is contemporary music. This isn't like anything you would find, 200 years ago, although it might be drawing from those references to create a new sound.
Yeah, because in the album art for Have One on Me, it features Joanna splayed across a chaise longue, that like kind of long like couch you'd see in like therapist offices. And she's surrounded by all of these antiques, like a leopard skin, gazelle statues, a large Chinese tapestry. I recently found out as part of research for this week that those are all antiques that she personally owns. She's a big antique collector. But it all collectively conveys this sense of Orientalism, and it's kind of making you think more 1920s or turn of the century than, 1700s or 1600s.
She talks about it too in interviews about being more physical and earthy album, that it's a little bit more about being a woman and being intoxicated, and it's very much about a breakup too throughout the whole album. So I think that there's something about it that was her synthesizing her personal life into something more mythical and more just like her, always like lush and baroque.
So it's hard to pick one track, from this album to say it's like emblematic, but I do want to play the titular track, Have One on Me, because it's the longest from the album. I'm going to play a sample of that now. So this song, it's really great. It lasts 11 minutes. It varies a lot in its song structure, as does every Joanna Newsom song. There are some elements that repeat, but there are like moments. I mean, when her songs are 10 minutes, from beginning to end, there will just be like all of these individual moments that feel like peaks in the song, or like she's building up to several different sort of peaks. And no 30-second clip does it justice. You should really listen to this one on its own, but I really love this one.
Yeah, I think it's maybe one of the more challenging and more like important tracks of the album, just because it is playing with song structure in the way that Joanna likes to. I think she's referred to her music in the past as being, she talks about her music as being impressionistic, but also coming from almost like a classical tradition, in the sense that she's interested in the way that like maybe a symphony would move through different movements throughout a whole, suite or overture.
Yeah.
And she's someone who isn't always thinking in terms of pop music kind of song structures. She wants to play with how something might loop back to an idea or go astray from it and come back. And I think this particular song, there is a feeling of like you don't entirely know what the story is, but you feel the emotion. Like she taps into this T.S. Eliot idea of like objective correlative, where you mention different things that are in the room to create an atmosphere rather than to tell people exactly what's happening. And I think that that's her great strength as an artist.
Yeah, this one feels to me like especially a stream of consciousness. I hunted on some info on what this song is actually about, and she said in an interview that the song is supposed to be located at one moment in time inside the mind of a particular narrator, which is alternating between kind of a fever and a breaking of the fever. So someone who's kind of ill and sort of narrating in that way. So alternating between lucidity and a more kind of scattered, hallucinatory narration. Like, how would you ever figure that out? I mean, apparently in the song booklet for Have One on Me, the lyrics, the two narrators were both, in regular print and italicized. So that's kind of a hint. But like, how would you ever know? I mean, her music is literally so layered. Do you know about the Joanna Newsom podcast? She does not have one. There's like this podcast where like they'll have like episodes that last like 2 hours, and then sometimes multiple parts just on individual tracks. Like, it's crazy how much work they put into dissecting it.
Yeah, and I feel like you think of people like dissecting Taylor Swift's lyrics, and you're like, don't even get me started on Joanna, my friend. But the thing about her is like she almost like, I think she probably has that relinquishing to the audience and letting them figure it out to the degree they want to. But I almost feel like she also likes the idea that it's dense and full of depth and textural, even if you don't figure out what it's about, and probably you never will. Like you still feel that almost like you're looking at an ancient civilization and the ruins of it or something. And I think I like to compare her a little bit to like the filmmaker Terrence Malick. I don't know if you've seen any of his films, but he's very impressionistic in the sense that there's not always like a linear narrative. Like there's these little glimpses of a life lived,
Yeah.
and they sometimes circle back to the beginning and come back to the present. I think Joanna Newsom is a true impressionist in that sense, where she's not trying to outline a super clear narrative. It's more she's trying to almost like mimic the way that memory actually functions when we think about when we're like walking to work or driving to work and we're kind of recalling the day before. It's never super linear. It's always like moments we experienced with someone or like an interesting exchange or the way the light hit the wall in a room or something. Like that's kind of more an actual transcription of how we record time. And the second that the present moment is gone, it becomes an idea. Like the past is always kind of an idea as much as the future is. The present is like the only like literal physical reality we have. And so I think Joanna Newsom plays with that sense of time quite a bit too.
It does feel like, sometimes like James Joyce or something, particularly with this song. And then the next and final album she's released is Divers. Were you very excited when Divers came out? What was your initial reaction to it?
Oh my gosh, I remember exactly where I was when that first Sapokanakan music video hit. I like woke up and like was like, this is not a drill to my friends and family who also love Joanna, and we were like watching the Paul Thomas Anderson music video of her walking through like New York, singing about all these like historical references. It was really exciting. And you said final album, but I'm like, no, it's not the final album. We're gonna get one, I swear. She's been playing some new songs, but
Yeah.
we're definitely gonna get it on her timeline, not ours.
Yeah. No, I mean, we'll get to the future in a moment, but okay, Divers, personally, between Milk Mender, Ease, Have One on Me, each one felt like this very like ambitious improvement on the last, where like there were these elements she kept adding, an orchestra, piano, a triple album. Divers felt a little bit more formulaic by the time it came out to me. So I was not as hyped. I did listen to it once or twice when it came out in 2015, but something didn't hit for me. I don't know why. I mean, I gave it a re-listen this week, and I really was glad I proved myself wrong. I really liked Anecdotes. I liked the titular track Divers. But let's actually play that song Sapokanakan, which you mentioned.
And then so then I tried to do well, but I won't be. Will you tell the one that I love to remember and hold me? I call and call for the doctor, but the snow swallows me whole. The flurry walkers behind lives only in print.
So we would have been remiss to not play at least one song that features Joanna playing the piano. Critics have, commented her piano playing skills are a little simpler than the harp. She's just a lot more used to the harp as an instrument, but I appreciate the variety. But do you have any other insights to share about Sapokanakan?
Well, again, it's footnote City Central USA. Like if you look at any of her lyrics, you'll see a reference to something, whether it's like a Percy Shelley poem
Mm-hmm.
or a painting that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or the fact that Washington Square Park was a potter's field, which is the old word for like an unnamed cemetery.
Yeah.
And she's always digging wherever she is, and you can tell in interviews she wasn't a big fan of her time in New York, that she's like a real California girl at heart. Respect, but wherever she is, she kind of like digs into what the local history is there. And honestly, that's one of those things that I've taken away as part of my own artistic practice that I feel like I've learned from her is like everywhere you go, there's something to be curious about. And the way that she kind of synthesizes those things back into her personal life is like just masterful.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder why she did feel compelled to write a song about New York City. Maybe it was just inspiration from traveling there, but do you happen to know?
Well, I know that she was there for a while because Andy Samberg was still on SNL and they were dating.
Yeah.
So I think she was going back and forth quite a bit, and like she even references and Have One on Me about him coming to visit her in California. I assume it might have been about Bill Callahan. We don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But we know that there's this kind of feeling of east to west in her songs as well, and that I don't know exactly. I think she's someone who like nothing is off limits. Like everything can kind of be synthesized back into her music if it feels like it's related to the cause of the song.
That makes sense. And then what do you know about the future? It does seem like she's working on her next album.
There's a lot of rumors, like I said, like, if you put Joanna Newsom new album Reddit into Google search, you'll see a lot of people, deciding what's gonna happen, but no one really knows. Like, I think she does have 2 children now. In my opinion, just from far away, she seems to be someone who's, like, totally present in whatever she's doing and kind of not worried about, anyone else's demands. Like, it took her about 6 years after Have One on Me to make another album, and maybe it's, like, one of those things where, like, Vashti Bunyan, where
Mhm.
she just wants to focus on motherhood and being there for her children in their important moments. But I do know that she has new songs. There's been a couple concerts in the last few years, including Kilby Block Party, which I saw 3 years ago. She played, I think that's one of her last concerts she's done in a while, besides maybe a guest appearance on the Fleet Foxes. But I
Yeah.
saw that one, and she played a couple new songs that were really quite beautiful. They felt like they were somewhere in between the sound of Have One on Me and Divers, and again, very much like about something else and synthesizing it back into like something that feels more personal and emotional. So I do think there's new songs in the work, and there's rumors that she's been in the studio, but no one really, really knows. Like, it could be 5 more years, it could be tomorrow, it could be maybe we'll get one in our 60s, Nathan. We don't know.
Yeah, we don't. I mean, she has played 7 unreleased, and 7 is enough for an album for her. I mean, who knows? I've listened to a couple, this week. I really loved The Air Again. That is probably one of my favorite Joanna Newsom songs, like, ever now, so I'm excited to see what she comes up with when it comes out. But do you have any, like, say, Joanna Newsom fun facts that haven't been brought up yet?
I mean, a big one is that she's something cousin, something removed from Gavin Newsom, like their family. So you kind of get the sense that she's like deeply, her family line is like deeply integrated into California. Like, they've been there for a long time. She's mentioned that they're like maybe English, Irish, Catholic immigrants that came to California.
Mhm.
But yeah, they're related. So often when you're trying to look up something about Joanna, something about Gavin comes up. But she also played in her brother's like grunge band, The Pleased, in her early like teenage years, and her brother and sister have gone on her on tour. They played in the Divers tour. I actually saw her in Boise. My sisters and I waited outside for her after, and she came and said hello to us, which was
Oh, you got
very
to meet
sweet.
her?
I did, yeah. I mean, I've met her a couple times, and that time maybe was the most meaningful one because it was right when I graduated art school,
Mhm.
my undergraduate degree in art, and it was like I was coming into the world deciding what I wanted to do, and being able to meet her was so important because I had listened to her albums, like, obsessively while working on my show, and she was extremely nice. They say don't meet your heroes, but she was so gracious and kind, and she came up and did a little selfie with me and put her little cheek next to mine. She's like, "Sorry, my cheek is really warm because I was just drinking rye in the tour bus." So, after her show, she's just enjoying a little drink and chill out, and she was nice enough to come chat with me and my sisters, and I gave her a drawing of, a Russian Tsar because I was like, "She'll like this, right?" But she was really sweet, but, that's a pretty fun fact. I mean, there's enough interviews in the early 2000s that if you are interested in going down a rabbit hole, she has some she's really funny too. That's the thing I like about her is she loves jokes. Like, apparently Fred Armisen introduced her and Andy Samberg to each other. So if she and Fred Armisen are friends, then I know that, the girl likes to laugh, and I appreciate that she has that part of her personality because you can tell there's this kind of encyclopedic academic part of her personality, but then she also is like just likes to, like, hang out and have a good time, so
That's so cool that you got to meet her. I mean, you've seen her in concert how many times?
like 8 times.
That's impressive. Because I mean, in my lifetime, I think she's only or not in my lifetime, but I mean, since the age of 13, 14, she's only performed in Chicago twice, and I saw her one of those times. You probably had to, like, kind of track her down in different places to see her perform, right?
Yeah, she did, like, a week in 2019, right before COVID. She did, like, a week residency at this, theater, Museo El Barrio
Mhm.
in, in Harlem, so she was playing there for, like, 5 days, and so I went to, like, two of them. She also played in Philly. I didn't get to see her early tours, though, so I'm really jealous that you got to see her have one on me. I was kind of the one I was the oldest child, so I was the one who got my sisters into Joanna Newsom, but kind of a little bit after her best album tours, in my opinion. But the Divers tours were amazing too, and she's obviously, like, incredibly professional and just knows how to play her instruments really well. There were a couple moments where her harp would break mid-concert because of the tension of the strings, and she would just let people ask her questions. So she's, like, very, very, like, receptive and responsive kind of entertainer, you know?
Yeah. So the only fun fact I want to bring up is just, okay, if you look her up on Spotify, the only song that even features her that you can listen to is the Muppet Show theme. Because in 2011, she contributed some vocals to that. But anyway, I mean, it turns out that her love of puppets goes a bit deeper because, starting in 2019, she did a few shows at the Bob Baker Marionette Theater, including 2 special shows for kids. And so there are these like videos you can see online where she's like performing next to puppets and there are children in the audience.
Yeah, my friend took her child to that in California, and she said that they had puppets the kids could play with during the show, which is really sweet, and that you had to be there with a child to, like, go to some of these shows, like the matinee. So, I think I don't know, there's something very touching about that
Yeah.
she, like, put so much importance in, the experience of children with her music too.
Yeah. And then next we can move on to Coco Rosie. Since this is an episode on freak folk, I just want to talk about the genre a little more broadly. We're going to discuss 2 more musicians. Or this is actually a band. And it was a musical group started by 2 sisters, Sierra Cassidy and Bianca Cassidy, in 2003. The band's name, it's a combination of both their childhood nicknames, Coco and Rosie. And even though the 2 of them are sisters, they actually were separated for several years and then reconnected 10 years later after Bianca made an impromptu trip to visit Sierra in Paris. And their home life is a little crazy, or was growing up. Did you read into that at all?
A little bit, yeah, and they seem to, like, say that they were trying to relive their childhood, trying to, like, reconnect later in life because it had been so tricky earlier on.
Yeah. So some of the details, and I'm actually going to, cut out a lot because it's quite a lot, but their mother compulsively moved the family to a new state each year. Like one of them was born in Iowa, the other was born in Hawaii. They also lived in places like Arizona, California, New Mexico. Their mother would like throw away most of their things each time they moved. And then their mom also like encouraged her children not to finish high school despite herself being a teacher. So that kind of gives you a sense of how they were raised. And they said in a recent interview with Talking Records that they were raised with a particular sense of identity as outsiders and that they never had the goal to fit in, even going so far to say that being weird was part of their value system. They're a group that you listened to when you were younger too, right? Like you got this sense of weirdness from them.
Right, and I was hungry, like I said, for things that sounded like Joanna Newsom after I had, like, listened to all of her discography. I was like, "I need more," and they really fit that bill because they had that kind of similar childlike vocals, but they also were doing strange things with the song structures themselves. Like, sometimes they sounded like pop songs, then all of a sudden they would take this kind of sinister turn, or they would, like, change up the vocals, or there'd be a unique
Like a
instrument.
hip-hop part.
Yeah, exactly, and they had really, like I think they really put the freak in freak folk, like, their album art was a little bit more, like, abrasive, like, them dressed up with these crazy, like, makeup ensembles that, like, were kind of sometimes a little drag or piratey or things like that, and so that was really eye-catching when you're, like, going through all these, like, gorgeous folk musicians on Last FM, and all of a sudden a Coco Rosie song comes up, and you're like, "What's going on?"
Yeah. No, this was actually the era when, Pandora was big. Like that's what people were using to listen to music. And so like if you were on the Joanna Newsom radio, then maybe like Coco Rosie would pop up. And they did have some songs with harps actually. But one of the things that's most notable about them is that they had some songs where they included like children's toys as part of the music. And that's, them, recreating their childhood on stage or, playing around. And this was like a core thing, not with just one song. Like most albums featured this to some degree, but I want to play one song that features this. This is Terrible Angels by Coco Rosie.
why do you welcome them? If every angel's terrible, then why do you welcome them?
Is this a song that you like listened to back in the day?
I actually was more on the Grey Oceans album, like that Lemonade song. I maybe listened to like 50 times over, and I would send it to my other friends who were into weird music. But this album, I'm not quite as familiar as, but I know that this is one of their more popular ones.
Yeah, this is from their first album, and it's the second most popular track. I mean, crazy to think about, but it has like 3 million plays on Spotify. That's probably, due to them just being around for so long and them just accruing that many listens. But this was not like, they were not like a minor band. This was like a big name in the 2000s around when Freak Folk was a thing. And I enjoyed Coco Rosie a lot when I was younger, but in contrast to Joanna Newsom, they're not someone I really listen to now. Like, I feel like I kind of have to force myself to, like I did for this week, going through the discography. And it's just because it kind of feels like it's too far outside of the zeitgeist. Like, people are not trying to be weird in the same way anymore.
Yeah, or like an Andy Warhol, for example. And then there's so many artists that like try to make art like Andy Warhol that are really bad.
Yeah.
Like I just was at this bad art fair recently, and I was like, man, there's like Andy Warhol has done such a devastating thing for our nation because there's so many like graffitied Mickey Mouses or like Marilyn Monroe paintings, and I feel like maybe there's a comparison here with like Coco Rosie and Joanna Newsom. Like, have you heard this term, like the indie girl voice? Like that kind of like, it's like a little bit more squeaky, childlike. It's kind of almost like a little Scandinavian sounding almost too, where like it's.
Yeah, I think I've heard people critique that type of singing style because the people singing are usually, white Americans who speak English as a first language, but then they're singing like they have an accent, like they're ESL. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, and or like that they're from Stockholm or something, or like yeah, it's like this. It's like I think when it sounds like an affect, it can be irritating and kind of it's hard on my ears. And I think with Coco Rosie, it's a little bit. I don't know. It felt like maybe they're like the music that came downstream of that was like you could trace it back to some of these artists like Regina Spektor, Coco Rosie, Joanna Newsom.
Yeah,
and so I think sadly sometimes when you hear the originals, you might, if you don't know the history there, you might associate it with that kind of commercial trend, that happens a lot with things becoming super popular,
yeah. But yeah, I mean, I do agree they really put the freak in Freak Folk. And it's too bad I don't want to listen to them anymore because I did find them interesting. I'm not sure that like Coco Rosie was taking inspiration from Joanna Newsom or trying to emulate the sound. I do think it's totally possible they independently arrived, playing the harp a little bit, having childlike vocals, but it's hard to say.
Yeah, and I think like other artists that we're not really talking about today are like that for me too, like the Decemberists, who you could argue are kind of like at least overlap a little bit with the Freak Folk, or like kind of Civil War revivalism music or something, that there was this strange thing in the air that was really important then, but for some reason it's harder for me to re-listen to now.
Yeah. The Decemberists are someone we talked about on Soft Colonial Wanderlust because they're like the best example of Soft Colonial Wanderlust fashion. And they're not someone I really listen to too much. And the next group we're actually going to discuss, actually, I didn't really listen to too much before this week either, but they're Animal Collective. So are you a fan of them?
I am, yeah. It's hard to put anything against my Joanna Newsom fandom, but I would say that actually in the last year I've been re-listening to a couple of their albums. I've been like listening to Merryweather Post Pavilion quite a bit. I saw Panda Bear play last year at Kilby Block Party in Salt Lake, and it was interesting to hear him play against all this other music that was at the festival. It's a pretty diverse festival, but it often kind of appeals to like Gen Z, millennial. There's last year we had New Orders. That was kind of one of the older acts, but there's a lot of this kind of like Phoebe Bridgers adjacent music that plays at this particular music festival. And to hear Panda Bear against that was like, wow, this is a different sound. And this is someone who's like kind of self-contained and knows who they are, like they don't really do not sound like anyone else. So, I mean, I know Panda Bear is a different project than Animal Collective, but Noah Lennox was a big part of that. So,
yeah. So Panda Bear is one of the members of Animal Collective. There are 4 of them, and they're known better by their monikers than their legal names. Their monikers being Avery Tear, Panda Bear, Deacon, and Geologist. Panda Bear is probably the most famous. I've heard his name before. And I don't want to get like too deep into the history unless there's anything interesting to bring up, but the band grew out of a collection of childhood friendships amongst the bandmates while they're growing up in Baltimore, Maryland. They were playing music together from a young age, middle school, high school, so there's that playfulness that's sort of endemic to freak folk. And then they formally formed the band in 2003. And then their music, it falls, farther outside of the bounds of freak folk, but I still think it in some ways fit in the 2000s, around 2004. Like their album Sung Tongs that dropped that year. I want to play one track from it. This is Winter's Love. So this is a good example of just what freak folk can sound like when it incorporates electronic instruments. They're using loops a little bit in this song, but I also realized listening to this album that like they're using loops to some degree, but also the way they sing, the four of them, they're trying to imitate loops acoustically. So that's an interesting element. They're kind of emulating electronic sounds, but without electronics at times. I listened to this whole album, for this week just to see what it was like. But you're more into their later work, right?
Yeah, but I did listen to this yesterday. I did drive a little bit, so I was listening to it, and again, kind of reminded me of some of that psychedelic stuff that was happening in the 60s and 70s, like the
That's
way
a good
that,
point.
the loops that happened. I think actually some person on YouTube was referencing Brian Wilson and that experimental energy that exists like in what's it called? Pet Songs for Pets. Oh my the famous album by the Beach Boys. Pet Sounds, sorry.
Pet Sounds.
I was like music for airports, music for pet sounds. It's Pet Sounds. But that way that he would just play with music in a way that was kind of just totally defying any pop music radio playability and was more about the experiment and the discovery. That seems like a really important part of this genre of freak folk music,
Yeah. I mean, that was a great point, though, about it sounding psychedelic, because thus far, all the other artists, their music sounds weird, but I don't really sense that psychedelia. But I could see that with Animal Collective's sound. Growing up, my siblings, my older ones, they were into Animal Collective. I do remember hearing Girls played quite a lot in the house, but for me, I just have this like personal preference for female vocalists, which is why I love Joanna Newsom a lot and Coco Rosie. But I kind of eschewed Animal Collective for the most part.
And I feel like Animal Collective was kind of like the butt of the joke back then of like, are you into Animal Collective? Like that was kind of one of the like hipster bar tests a little bit of like what level of like freak were you really,
Yeah. So you had to be really into the weeds to be into them.
I think so. And I think they still, talking to my art guy friends that like who really like them, like that there is like a certain level of respect that has still transcended that decade, of like the kind of intensity of their loops and the kind of it's not quite a mathiness is not the right word with them because I think there's something kind of organic, earthy, and natural about some of the sounds that they're creating, but at the same time the loops and when you listen to the music, you kind of do get a synesthesia of like almost like fractals or like overlapping psychedelic imagery. Like it feels that way when you listen to the songs, but also they didn't have any fear of like noise. Like there are times when they're like shrieking or there's cymbals and then all of a sudden it gets quiet again. There's a little bit of that going on.
Yeah. Even the track we just discussed, Winter's Love, the first 2 minutes and the final 3 minutes they sound like different songs and they just stitched it together for some unclear reason. Yeah, you have to be in a really, really particular mind space to like want to listen to this. It's not really like background music.
It's not, but I do think, I hope you don't mind if I make one more kind of strange comparison, but Tame Impala, who's I think has different music sensibilities than Animal Collective, even though they're both animal-based band names. But Tame Impala, I think, is a little bit more jazzy, a little bit more listenable radio music. But he does this similar thing where he plays with loops until like a harmony is kind of slowly revealed over time.
Yeah.
And I think Animal Collective, when they really came into their own, I think that they were starting to do that where something would reveal itself slowly over time, and that's where the thrill would come with listening to them. It wasn't just about listening to something difficult. It was about investing in something and then kind of realizing that it pays off. And that's, I think, why there is quite a bit of devotion there still.
Yeah, I can see that. And then to transition, so for this week, I found this documentary, The Family Jams from 2009, that I was really excited to discover because it's kind of like winning the lottery when I'm doing an episode on one of these obscure music genres or art movements, and like there happens to have been someone who documented them as they were happening. And this documentary, it follows Devendra Banhart, Joanna Newsom, and Vetiver, who we haven't mentioned, but they're a freak folk band, as they were touring the USA in 2004. And I just want to give it a shout out, but I watched a lot of documentaries. It's not that great. It's really just kind of a series of vignettes where like, I mean, you can see like that this was a real movement in the sense that like these people knew each other, they were connected, they were traveling. Like Devendra Banhart and Joanna Newsom were friends, which to me is kind of crazy. Like seeing their personalities in the documentary, I'm like, what did she see in that guy? Like he is not someone I would want to personally hang out with, but yeah, this was in like a true sense a movement in the idea of like them having actual social ties.
Totally. I mean, we haven't talked about Sufjan Stevens, but there's like a picture of Joanna Newsom and him that I like to look at and say, this is mom and dad for all the arty kids who grew up in the early aughts. I think Sufjan's kind of a little bit more in the Baroque pop genre, like maybe a little less so freak folk, but certainly had some ties there too.
Yeah.
But I do think that it's interesting to think that these are all the same people hanging out at the cool kid parties during Obama era music scene, you know?
Yeah. And something they would do in the documentary that was interesting to see is like improvise music together and play as a group. The documentary is named The Family Jams. The family part, Devendra Banhart, he actually wanted freak folk to kind of be called The Family, which I think is a much worse term because it's also like referencing Charles Manson.
Classic.
He called his like group of followers The Family. And then the jams part was like how they would jam together in the documentary. But it was cool to see that. There was that playfulness where they'd improvise music together.
Yeah, I just saw, I think I referenced this in our last podcast episode, but I saw Easy Rider last year, and there's this scene where there's like this kind of hippie commune in the middle of, it's either California or like the southwest of the US, and there is a little bit of that feeling like you can feel the influence of that culture of these artists' parents kind of seeping in a little bit. There's this like slightly communal 70s thing that they absorbed through osmosis and are turning into their own maybe contemporary version, if that makes sense. Like especially when you hear about Devendra's background, and I know that like Joanna Newsom's parents were like pretty politically involved in like progressive politics in the area as well. So they had like maybe a little bit more of a yuppie spin on that, but
yeah. No, I mean, that actually ties into this other point I want to make, which basically when I was researching the biographies of all of these freak folk musicians, I realized that a lot of them had received Waldorf educations, like Joanna Newsom directly, Panda Bear and Deacon from Animal Collective directly, and then, the sisters in Coco Rosie, they're raised by a mom who is a Waldorf teacher. And so that made me start to think, okay, why is that? Like, is this whole music subgenre the result of being raised by 60s parents who valued the humanities and the arts and wanted to give them this particular type of education? And the answer is kind of yes, because I looked into like Waldorf, and basically music is treated as a core subject in the same way that like math and science are, and kids are taught from a young age how to play things like pentatonic flutes. And then they transition to more complex instruments, and you're free to learn how to say like play the harp as part of your education. Did you ever grow up with any Waldorf kids or encounter any in college?
I grew up in the DC metropolitan area for most of my childhood, and most of the kids there, we were in public schools, but the public schools were like known to be pretty good. And then we moved to Georgia.
Oh yeah.
And when I went to public school there, and like it was still a decent school, but I felt the kind of difference. But I didn't encounter a ton of Waldorf kids, but I remember as a kid in Georgia who wanted to know what was going on in the world, I would like scour like Brooklyn vegan articles and Pitchfork and try and figure out what these hipsters were doing knitting and going to church in Brooklyn. Like I was like fascinated by this whole world of like spiritual knitter musicians. Sufjan was like probably my like number one high school crush, you know. So I was listening to all these interviews or reading whatever I could. And I did notice this as a kid. I was like, all these kids went to Waldorf schools. I was like, why did my parents send me to Waldorf school? But there is something interesting about that era too. When you think it's just kind of like George W. Bush into Obama era. There's an interview with Bjork where someone also asks her about the anti-folk freak folk label and if she's comfortable with that. And she says, you know what, I'm not so sure about that, but I will say that in a time when it feels like, you know, everything is more machine and more corporate, there's something about us all wanting to kind of go back to nature, go back to organic, tactile learning, and like that there was this kind of earthiness that so many artists were feeling like they like. And I say this to my students all the time that art history is often just a series of reactions of like one generation reacting to the previous kind of like overall mainstream. And so that's how these movements often happen. It's like the pendulum swinging in a different direction.
Yeah. But what's interesting with this is it's not so much a reaction against the previous generation, but an embrace of it. You know, all of these freak folk artists, they were valuing the like formal training in the arts that they received from their Waldorf educations that their parents wanted them to have. They had the values of valuing the humanities like their parents seemed to have. And I think, you know, this kind of does relate back to the central thesis of my podcast around car-oriented development in the mid-20th century. Because what I do and what I do with my co-hosts is basically try to think about how do we bring back some of the institutions of prior generations before car-oriented development really reshaped things. And this is a really good example, actually, of a whole cohort of like young artists, young musicians literally doing that, of finding the music their parents liked, getting the formal training to actually perform in that style, and then executing it. This was like a true revival in this way that's like kind of hard to come by.
Totally. And I think like both things are true. Like it was both a reaction and an and kind of a connection back to parents. Like their parents obviously had this like almost I hate to like categorize or stereotype, but it's almost like a Gen X sensibility of like, yeah, we're like anti-corporate, anti-greed, or like destroying the environment. Like a lot of these conversations with these artists, they often go back to environmentalism and like how things are messed up because of greed. And so their parents were instilling these values that were a little bit counterculture, but still kind of integrated into the bigger culture.
Yeah.
And so they were like, I feel like these artists were like trying to like approach these ideas through music, you know?
Yeah.
But that's interesting, yeah, like to think of like this is kind of like almost like a more accessible version of the hippie movement that like made it more like approachable to people that maybe weren't living in California in the 70s, you know?
Yeah, those themes, like the countercultural aspects of the 60s, were a lot more explicit in that documentary, The Family Gems, than I kind of expected. Like there are all these scenes of Devendra like shirtless playing a guitar, and it like actually felt like something that could be in a commune, but instead it was in a theater with an audience. And yeah, it is like a lot more palatable, like you said. I think it felt kind of just out there enough for the 2000s to not feel like cosplay. It kind of felt like a unique or a new zeitgeist, which it in some ways was.
Well, yeah, and you think people were like they were like joining these smaller, more spiritual religious groups like Devendra's parents. And then in the last couple decades, you know, where consumption has really become the main mode of expression, you know, turning that stuff into music makes it more approachable for like the mainstream to like be like, oh, okay, maybe like I can take in these ideas through listening, or maybe this, you know, it influences the culture in hopefully a positive way through like this more earthy, more like connected to these bigger questions about life and death, you know, through songs that are like radiant and beautiful.
Yeah, they sure were beautiful. But thank you for discussing this topic with me. Is there anything else you want to promote before we wrap up, like your show? Anything else that you're coming out with?
And thank you so much for having me on. It's been so fun to come back. And it's funny coming back because we talked about gas stations initially together back in the fall,
Yeah.
and this summer, I'm putting together a show with students. It's called Rest Stop, which is also the name of our podcast episode.
Mhm.
We're creating an art exhibition at a local gas station in Utah, and we're gonna put art, like good contemporary art that the students are making. We're gonna curate it and maybe invite a couple guests and put it out in a space where people come to get, their gas tank filled up to get snacks. It'll be kind of a funny low and high, like, places where you aren't usually thinking about art, that kind of being disrupted,
Mhm.
and we'll be hopefully, doing some documentation of that, so that's kind of fun. That's more of in my teaching wheelhouse, but I'm also working on that show I talked about with you, which is called 2002 Subaru Forester. It's opening at the Utah Museum of Contemporary Art September 11th, and I'm working on that right now and probably will make it into, like, a book form when it's finished too, so,
Cool.
people can check out my work on Instagram. It's just my name, Madeline Rupard, or my website, madeline.rupard.com, which badly needs to be updated. But yeah, also we can share that funny playlist, and, thank you for having me. It's so fun, and it's such a interesting. I'm actually going to Kilby Block Party today. It's just starting again, so I'm gonna see, like, Japanese Breakfast and Turnstile and some other artists tonight that I'm excited to see, but it's funny to, like, go back through musical history and think about, like, the things I'm interested in now and how they kind of go back to this moment in freak folk, and I feel, like, lucky we were, like, kinda coming of age at that time because it was such a unique part of American music history, I mean, broader music history.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an era that's starting to be forgotten, so it was fun to, like, rethink about it, preserve it, give it some attention. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed the concert, and I'll link all of those links in the show notes. So please give Madeline a follow. Her paintings are great. She's one of my favorite people to follow on Instagram, so check her out.
Thanks, Nathan. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.